Today on Think Change, we are diving into the intersection of geopolitics, trade, and tariffs. In today's world, trade policies are more than just economic levers. They are instruments of influence, of competition, and at times conflict. And right now, global trade tensions are escalating. President Trump's tariff hikes on Mexico, Canada, and China have heightened uncertainty over his trade policy. The OECD warns that escalating US trade tariffs could slow global growth and drive up inflation. But beyond the headlines, a deeper transformation is underway. The global trade system is undergoing shifts. Countries are diversifying supply chains, they are rethinking economic alliances. Regional trade agreements like the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA as it is known, are gaining momentum, and they offer a critical opportunity to strengthen Africa's economic resilience. So, where is global trade headed? Are we on the brink of a new era of economic fragmentation? Or can multilateral institutions, regional agreements, innovative trade mechanisms provide stability? To unpack these issues, here with me in studio, I have Pamela Cook-Hamilton, the Executive Director of the International Trade Center, and Jody Keane, Senior Research Fellow in the International Economic Development Group here at ODI Global. Also joining us online is Teddy Subramanian, the Chief Executive Officer of the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, or COMESA, Business Council. Pamela, I'll start with you. It's really great to have you with us in studio. I've often heard you say that trade is a human story. Can you explain what you mean by that? And also, given the direct impact of international trade on people's daily lives, especially in the poorest countries, how should we respond to the current global developments, which are increasingly concerning?
Thanks so much, Sara. It's so good to be here. And of course, this is a very timely conversation. When I say trade is a human story, let me give you a very clear example, one that I always use because I think it encapsulates what we do and why we do it. There's a company called White Energy in Zambia, and we were able to leverage working with them and developing her capacity to promote her solar energy business. We got an angel investment of $250,000 alongside the work that we did with her. Through that single investment, she was able to provide 9,000 homes with electricity for the first time, 60,000 people. And that is one simple, single help that we have done through the ITC's programming. And everything we do at the end of the day is about human lives. It's about building their capacity to live, to thrive, to support their children, to move forward. One of the reasons we focus so much, for example, on the gender aspect is because women are generally the ones who look after their family, look after the communities, build schools, enable others to grow. And so that's why, for me, trade is not just about tariffs and non-tariff measures and, who's doing what. It's about the human lives that are impacted by this. And so that's why it becomes so much more difficult in this current environment. I must admit, as I said, I've moved from shock to paralysis to now, what's
The 5 stages
the
of
five
grief,
stages?
right?
Yes. So denial, then bargaining, So it's trying to look at, okay, what are the implications? Where are we going to be, 2-3 years from now? While we talk about tariffs and, escalating tariffs and tariff retaliation, what is missing is the fact that when we have this constant back and forth, it creates instability in the system, even if at the end of the day, it doesn't happen. The threat of it happening is just as bad. And so when you put in a tariff and then say, okay, no, we're not going to do it, wait 90 days, it creates a whole instability in the system that never quite settles back down. And so that then affords countries, for example, the opportunity and also gives them the impetus to begin to shift their relationships, to shift their trading engagements. Take China, for example. In 2017, China's dependence on the US market was at about 20%. Since that time, they have lowered their dependence on the US market between 2017 and now 2024 to 13%. Why? Because they recognized what this would mean. I think this is going to happen with Canada, it is going to happen with Europe, and it is going to happen with Mexico. And so when we see all these shifts starting to happen, what will it mean for not just the global trading system, but the US itself in terms of its own positioning and the US consumer? The other thing that a lot of people don't recognize, and I was listening to some interviews, online with various consumers, and they think the tariffs are going to be paid by China or by who? No. What it is necessary to explain that tariffs that are imposed on an imported product are generally passed on to consumer, which means that your
Pretty much always.
that's it.
Pretty
Oh,
much
yes,
always.
I'm trying to be gracious, nobody absorbs that
Yeah,
tariff, they pass it on. And so your costs are going to increase. The price of everything from, from any manufactured product now, from washing machines to iPhones to whatever. And in addition, the impact on inflation. There is going to be huge inflation now coupled with mass unemployment. The implications in terms of just economic and social stability have not been really looked at. I think people are underestimating what this is going to mean. And so I think these are the elements that, one, make it a human story, and two, ensure that we have to look at the long game. And we have to look at what the possibilities are going to be, and how do we, as organizations, try to help to recenter the narrative and also promote the aspect that it is a human story, and that we have to make sure that at the end of the day, it's humans who will benefit.
Oh, absolutely. One market that has received a lot of attention, and rightly so, given its significance in the human story of trade, is Africa. Teddy, you have extensive experience as a trade negotiator for Mauritius, and now, of course, as the CEO of the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa Business Council. You advocate in your role for the private sector across 21 African countries. That represents a market of over 600 million people. Can you share how businesses in Africa and other developing economies are navigating the growing unpredictability of trade policy? How do they see these global trade shifts impacting African industries and the whole regional trade integration process, both in terms of challenges, but maybe potential opportunities?
No, thank you. Thank you, Sara. First of all, let me say that I fully subscribe also to what Pamela has just said, and these are very pertinent points. But to come back to your question, Sara, first, we have to recognize also, we have to be cognizant of the fact that African countries, and businesses for that matter, have been facing a series of challenges in the recent past. It's not something new. We have had the COVID-19 pandemic. African countries have been seriously affected. We have been having wars affecting their main trading markets. We have had geopolitical tensions in the world, but also in Africa itself. Further, you also have the dependence on external market, the dependence of African countries on external markets, which accentuate the shocks on these African countries and on our businesses. Obviously, when you have changing policies in these countries, it will affect them negatively. So that is a fact. But also, what is happening also, many of the businesses in the African region, which are mostly SMEs, because SMEs are predominant on the African continent, have also been affected by natural calamities relating to climate change, drought, load shedding, for example. At the moment in Zambia, we are having load shedding. We have electricity for 4 hours. Just imagine the impact on the businesses, for example. So we are not waiting to have some changes in the rest of the world for it to have an effect on Africa. Africa is already undergoing a number of crises already. And the business community, they have to adapt to these circumstances, because if they don't, then our own survival will be at stake. So they are learning to become more resilient to these emerging crises. But there is a lot of ground to cover, and Pamela is very well aware of that. There is a lot of work to be done for the business community to be able for them to adapt to the changing circumstances in the world. Now, Sara, if I may, as a representative of the business community, we are promoting the development of regional value chains on the continent, in the region, in the COMESA region, the local sourcing for partnership, which I think is very important. Market information. We did work with ITC, for example, on African Trade Observatory. We are working on business. So we want to boost intra-Africa trade. That is very, very important, so that we can be able to face the shocks when it comes from the rest of the world. Just to give you a figure on top of my head, 15% is the level of intra-Africa trade. It's very low when you compare it to the rest of the regions. We have a number of digital platforms also that can help businesses in the region develop and become more resilient. In fact, these challenges, Sara, to reiterate one more, is emphasizing the need for us to build our capacity on the African continent. It is an opportunity, I think, for our businesses to invest in regional manufacturing, food production, pharmaceutical, and so on. But more fundamentally, and I weigh my word for it, it means what it means. I think it is an opportunity for us in Africa to rethink our long-term partnership model, which in my opinion should become more sustainable and predictable. Very often when we have a problem in another part of the world, then obviously we turn to Africa, to the solution. But that should no longer be the case, because Africa should become part of the solution on a permanent and sustainable basis. So I tend to agree, Sara, in general, with the view that this shift will definitely strengthen regional integration in Africa and hopefully beneficial to our industrialization process.
And of course, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is one of these, regional integration mechanisms, is considered, in fact, a vital mechanism to boost Africa's economic resilience. But we're also seeing a rise in regional trade integration in the ASEAN region, in Latin America, in other parts of the non-OECD space. What lessons do you think can be drawn from these efforts? How can smaller economies avoid being caught in the crossfire of geopolitical trade wars? Judy?
Yes, sure. So yes, I mean, just to echo the points that Teddy's made there, I think, Africa and other parts of the developing world, they're looking at what's happening in the States. They're looking at, announcements by other major developed countries in relation to slashing aid budgets and so on. So they are rethinking their longer term relationships. And it's important to note that whilst industrial policy has come back in the West, it's come back in the US, it's coming back in the UK, we're still awaiting our new industrial strategy. It never went away in other parts of the developing world. It was always there. This is the kind of key lesson from the growth of the East Asian newly industrialized countries, the kind of model of the flying geese, the fragmentation of production across East Asia, deepening integration by pulling in Malaysia, Indonesia, the kind of so-called second tier newly industrialized countries. And it's all been driven by different types of industrial policy. So it's not the kind of 1930s tariff, it's more focused on innovation. There are just, massive differences in the amount of expenditure on innovation in China compared to the United States. And of course, China realizes that, imposing tariffs to support its own industrialization policy would just be massively shooting itself in the foot. So I do echo the points that Pamela made, that the kind of ramifications of the policies that are being introduced by Trump for kind of domestic security, economic security, that is really, really quite troubling, because consumers are going to be hit and they're not going to be very happy. So again, it's just reinforcing, the movement away from traditional markets towards new markets. South-South trade is growing. We know that the African Continental Free Trade Area is all about boosting intra-regional trade, moving away from what are considered to be kind of more extractive trading relationships that have kind of accentuated commodity dependency over time, towards intra-regional value chains, whereby you've got different parts and components being produced in different parts of the continent, very similar to what happened in East Asia.
Exactly.
And that thinking is quite prominent in some parts of the continent, in some countries across the different ministries. So I think, this shift, this pattern is going to continue. I feel that it is very positive, and I think we've also got some lessons that we could learn, in the UK and the US through looking at how these processes are managed.
Do you want to add anything on this? Or what? No. Talia, I want to go back to you. I mean, clearly, we have this massive and growing geopolitical strain on the multilateral trading system. Do you think existing trade governance and support architecture can withstand the shocks that we are observing? And what reforms, what innovations really are needed to strengthen global trade cooperation, particularly to ensure that developing economies are not massively disadvantaged?
Yeah, I hope I've been able to get your question because you were breaking a little bit on my side. If I may,
I can
kindly
repeat
ask
it. I
you to
can repeat it.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think, given the growing geopolitical strain on the multilateral trading system that we are observing, do you think that the existing trade governance and support architecture can withstand these shocks? And what reforms or innovations are needed to strengthen global trade cooperation and really ensure that developing economies are not massively disadvantaged?
Yes, no, first of all, Sarah, I think that's a very important question that you raise. First and foremost, I think we need to reaffirm our commitment to the multilateral trading system. And it sets some principle to ensure fairness and for it to be a barrier against all kind of protectionist motives. It has to be like that. I think the system will play its role so long as the majority of its members abide by its rules. Yeah, but having said that, I think at the same time we have to reckon that the multilateral trading system faces a lot of challenges today. For example, the blockages of the adjudicating bodies, delays in delivering on negotiation, and so on. But also there is some kind of misalignment with contemporary challenges, such as climate change.
Yeah.
Attempts at trying to reform the WTO, the multilateral trading system in the past has failed. But I believe the membership should now be bold enough to revisit the multilateral trading system in its entirety. But I don't think that looking at governance or some aspect of it will solve the problem. I think we need to look at international trade with evolving lenses, because today there are linkages. I think Pamela mentioned it at the beginning, the human dimension. There are linkages to all the spheres of our lives. For example, climate change, famine, health issues, cybersecurity, and so on. So basically what I'm trying to say, we need to look at international trade with contemporary lenses.
Camilla, I will come back to climate change that you raise a really important issue, especially since we have Jody with us. But I want to stay a bit longer on the AfCFTA. Pamela, why is the role of the AfCFTA so important in this context of trade and value chain development? And where do you think it should focus in the coming years? And also, what is the ITC going to do? And what role is it going to play there?
I was just thinking about what Teddy was saying about, the geopolitics and rethinking trade. And it's something that we've been also thinking about a lot at the ITC. And I personally have been thinking a lot. It keeps me up at night. Why? Because I think one of the most powerful aspects of the AfCFTA, at least for me, is that it sends a signal that Africa is reasserting itself on the global stage. Not just even in terms of trade, but in terms of global positioning. And I think that is, for me, one of the most powerful aspects of this. If it never achieves all the grand things that are in it, it still would have sent a signal that this is where Africa is going and we are together on this. And so the need to rethink or reassess trade and the contemporary view of trade needs to come into the 21st century. That is my view. And the AfCFTA is a representation and a reflection of that we have to move from the old commodity extractive processes and begin to look at how do we invest and build in the continent from where all of these resources are taken. From cocoa to coffee to cobalt. Everybody's talking about critical minerals now, but let's go back. Who is the biggest exporter of coffee in the world? The Netherlands. Seriously? Cocoa, chocolate. Who is the biggest exporter of chocolate? Switzerland, Brussels. I mean, we have to begin to look at the reality of how the world trade has been set up in the metropole satellite era for so long, and redesign the process so that those who have the resources are also able to benefit and build lives on those resources. Nobody's talking about protectionism. Nobody's talking about blocking trade. But it is important that in this new era, with the move towards value chain, the EVs and all the various utilization of the mineral, that Africa benefits on the ground from that. By 2050, more than 60% of Africa's population will be under 25.
Yes.
Do we understand the implications of that and the need to provide jobs? And so for us, the AfCFTA is an opportunity to rebalance and to reassert. And so one of the things that we've been doing at ITC is not just helping in terms of the negotiations itself. So we've worked on the goods and services and other protocols. We've been working with the women and gender and the youth protocol, etc. We've also been working on explaining to people how it works, how to trade under this new AfCFTA. What is it that will be required? We've provided information basis. Teddy mentioned the Africa Trade Observatory, which is a critical element and a pillar of the AfCFTA process. We've done studies that showcase what are the primary potential value chains that can really catapult the AfCFTA and Africa into the 21st century. And so for us, it's really important to not just talk about value addition of what exists, but also value addition in new sophisticated areas. We're talking about pharma, of course, right?
Yeah.
After COVID, we saw what happened. How do we have a situation where this doesn't happen again for 1.2 billion people? How do we also have a situation where when one country is invaded, Africa has a food crisis? No. I mean, I'm sorry, but really?
Yes.
Everything is there. There's no reason why this should happen. But because of the way that trade has been done. So I think this is where...
just to say, this is a consistent issue that gets raised on Think Change when we have leading African voices coming to talk about the challenges of the continent.
Absolutely. It is, it cannot continue.
Yeah.
And so I think that the AfCFTA is the first major decision by all African heads that this needs to happen, and we're committed to making it happen. There will be hiccups, there have been hiccups, but this sends a very clear signal, and this is what we're working on with the African continent to make sure that this also changes the terms of trade.
No, of course, and we are equally fully committed to the Global to supporting the Secretariat. We work very closely with the AfCFTA Secretariat and to implement the agreement in a number of countries. Yes, Teddy.
Yes, Sara. No, I think definitely I totally agree with what Pamela has said. I think that's a great opportunity for African countries. But I would like to caveat that a little bit, if I may, on the AfCFTA. I think, yes, I think it has the potential to build that resilience of African countries, but we have to make sure that it is successfully implemented. But for that to happen, we need to have the business community buy-in. And this is not happening at the moment. I'm going to be very candid with you. I think we don't have the business community buy-in in the AfCFTA. So if we don't have this, I think the AfCFTA will remain an agreement in letter only.
But Teddy, you're absolutely right. The implementation deficit for virtually all of our countries, developing countries, is a huge problem. We sign agreements. We're very good at negotiating them.
Exactly.
Somehow they never cross over to the private sector. And this is
Exactly.
where, organizations like COMESA come in, right? The business councils of these regional economic groups,
Yes.
because it is you who will be able to translate these possibilities, these potential into tangible business opportunities and investment. We're working on the first SME ministerial global is going to be in South Africa in July. And part of that will have a business innovation space and business to business engagement. And we think it's a great opportunity to begin to look at these new opportunities and provide the way of bringing the private sector in so that they can take advantage of these opportunities as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. So we are ready to be part of it. I mean, sorry to prolong the discussion because that's an important topic for us as well. Because, one of the things is we have to train 1.3 billion people on the continent. So that's a lot. And so we are talking about the billions and billions of people to train. But also fundamentally, Pamela, I think, over and above of bringing in the private sector, I think the African countries themselves, African businesses, we need to rethink about the model.
Yes.
The business model that we have.
Yeah.
I believe it should be a public-private sector model so that we become
Absolutely.
less reliant on foreign sources. And I think this is a change in mindset that we require on the African continent. And to be frank with you, it is not there at the moment. We need to develop that mindset to develop that public-private sector partnership so that the AfCFTA really works. So it can't be the public sector, it can't be the private sector, it can't be international organization. It has to be implemented by African countries, African businesses. So basically, I agree with what you just said.
Well, I'm glad we found agreement on that point. As we approach the end of the episode, I want to return to something we mentioned earlier, an area where there is clearly less consensus, which is climate. Jody, you lead our work on climate, trade, and development here at ODI Global, and we've discussed the idea of the green squeeze on Think Change before. Given everything that is happening, and with the Trump administration now rolling back key provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, how optimistic are you that the global green transition can stay on track?
Thanks, Sara. Yes. So I think just to echo Teddy's point, really, that there is a majority, there are kind of groups of like-minded countries at the WTO that really do want to make progress on this front. I know, Pamela, you're just back from the Gambia. Obviously, Gambia is the least developed country, and it is one of the handful of least developed countries that has been actively engaging in the plurilateral discussions at the WTO. So, you've got a lot of country buy-in, and you do have business buy-in as well to this agenda. Teddy, I can understand, when it comes to new measures that are being introduced by the EU, we know that there's been a massive gap in terms of business engagement and how those measures are communicated with business. But overall, business on the ground gets the sustainability challenge. I think for the producers in Zambia, they fully get this, but they are also being affected by the impacts of climate change. So I think you've got kind of progress being made by like-minded groups of countries at the WTO. You've got new partnership approaches being launched by the Commission. Just yesterday, there's a series of big announcements, but I really do see that we've got this big gap in terms of thinking about countries that are at the forefront of the impacts of climate change now. So I think that there is a need for a kind of change in mindsets where, we're trying to move away. You've got the very real tensions on, the transition, the costs, the loss of jobs and whatnot. But we've also got,
opportunities. Yeah.
There are big opportunities there. And we've also got the fact that, the effects are being felt now on the ground. And, this will affect the US just as much as it will affect poorer countries. I know just earlier in our discussion, we were talking about hurricane season, and Trump will see, undoubtedly within his term, the US will experience some level of disruption. So, we need to find solutions. I think countries need to work with the Trump administration. It's a different type of diplomacy. It's going to be a different type of ball game. It's all about kind of mutual interests and really
deals.
clearing,
and just
really clearly getting that right up front. So there potentially are opportunities there if we think about the role of digital ICT. I know for Pacific Island states that were affected by tsunamis, linking up to satellites. So that's a whole area that remains underexplored, that perhaps, some people in the Trump administration may be able to help out with
Can
that.
I give you an example on that? When Jamaica was hit by Hurricane Beryl, because where my family is from, St. Elizabeth, the southeast part of the island, was literally 85% of the housing stock that lost their roofs. Kingston didn't know. So my Kingston friends were saying, oh, no, we're fine. We didn't have any issues. Why? Because there was no link. All the Digicel, all of it had gone down. And so it was friends who had a link to the satellite who were able to then communicate that this is how bad it is and this is what happened. So this is real,
Yeah, definitely. This is a real problem. As I mentioned to you, in Zambia at the moment, we have, we had a drought for 2 years. Now we're starting to have some rain, but this is having an impact on energy generation as well, load shedding. So it's having a lot of, and it's happening. It's a reality. It's no longer
I know it is a reality. Not everyone agrees,
reality.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, we're nearly out of time, but before we wrap up, I'd really like to hear some final reflections from each of you. We've covered some major shifts, rising protectionism, shifting alliances, and the increasingly overt use of trade policy as a geopolitical tool. Looking ahead, what key signals should we be watching in the coming weeks to better understand where global trade might be heading?
I'll go for it. So I think it's going to be quite turbulent, and we've kind of seen lots of announcements, but we're yet to see what will be implemented. And I don't want to get my crystal ball out, but we may see that Trump's bark is worse than his bite in some cases, because this is, the world has moved on. I think, Pamela, you gave some great statistics there about, how important the US is as an end market. We've seen dramatic shifts. That's likely to continue. And we've also got this shift in the global economy in terms of the role of services, traded services and so on. So you may see that the bark is worse than its bite. And then obviously it's all about kind of deal making, mutually beneficial. So it's a kind of different style of diplomacy. So countries need to adapt to that, and perhaps, just shift their focus in terms of how they approach and how they engage. And it may be, Teddy, this kind of the greater role of the business community, getting, kind of setting up your trade and economic diplomacy strategies up in a different way in order to engage. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Teddy, do you agree?
Yeah, definitely. Of course, that I agree. But I think more importantly, I think we need to watch the signals on whether countries, how they are retaliating and engaging, whether it's leading to a trade war. I think which route they choose to go, either the unilateral route or the multilateral route, or even redirecting their trade flows. Some are saying, okay, we're not going to trade with X, Y, and Z. We're going to trade with A, B, C, D. So we need to look at the trade. Certainly, then the global trade data will tell us a bit about, what changes are taking place. But also we have to be careful also in reading into statistics, because we really need to look at disaggregated statistics to see what is happening at country level, also at the level of sectors. But I see, more generally, I think we need to keep an eye also on the current wars in the Middle East, in Europe and in Africa, to see whether the tensions are being alleviated. At the moment, it's very murky, so we don't know what is happening. So we need to keep an eye also on these global tensions.
Very good. Pamela, your final reflections.
Final reflection. I want to end on a positive note.
Please.
Despite everything, and I think the proof of the pudding will be to see how the US engages with the WTO when the new representative arrives, because that will tell us a lot more, and we'll have a firmer sense of where this is going. But I think that we always ought to remember that there's nothing new under the sun. We've been here before in different, dispensations, but we've been here before. And the smooth holiday tariff, we've been down this road. And so I think while it is different, we have a kind of playbook, and we kind of have an idea where this will go and what the implications are. And you're right, there are going to be balances. because the private sector in the US wants to make money. They don't want to lose. So if they see things happening in a way that may impact them in a very negative way, they will put pressure. So, I think we can't always predict in finite terms what the implications will be. But I think that the world is pretty resilient. We will find a way.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Think Change. A huge thank you to our guests, Pamela, Jody, and Teddy, for sharing your expertise and insights, while we've unpacked some of the biggest issues in global trade today, from escalating tariffs to shifting alliances and the growing role of regional integration. We're witnessing global markets continuing to face pressure due to volatile trade policies that leads to uncertainty in economic growth, in supply chains, in international cooperation. As businesses and policymakers navigate these complexities, staying agile, diversifying trade partnerships, prioritizing resilience in supply chains will be essential. And for Africa, leveraging regional trade agreements like the AfCFTA and strengthening infrastructure, fostering value-added industries will be key to building long-term economic resilience. Thanks for tuning into Think Change. Don't forget to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform and follow the iGlobal for more conversations on the biggest policy challenges of our time. Until next time, thanks for listening.